Hi, everybody. I am Roberto Musso, president of the DIGEO from Chile, and I am very happy to be here. Chile is a long and narrow country in the south of the world. Surrounded by mountains and seas, we are like an island in Latin America. In the extreme south, we have the wonderful Patagonia. In the north, we have the Atacama Desert, the driest in the world. In the middle of the Pacific Ocean, we also have Easter Island, with the serious moais living over there. Above us, we have the complete universe, since our skies are the purest in the world. That's why we are very strong in astronomy, by the way. Chile, the bigger copper producer in the world, leads Latin America in several economic indexes, but we are still an emerging country. The whole Latin America is basically in the same state. But our people suffer from great inequality as a result of our recent history. We still have a lot of work to do to become a developed country and to reduce this inequality. Technology and entrepreneurship can help us to achieve both goals. I mean, economic prosperity and social equality. So let's take a closer look at the state of entrepreneurship in Chile and Latin America. Compared to when I started my first digital company in 1997, without any kind of knowledge or help, now we know much more about entrepreneurship. Now we have good books and lots of experience. Now we have a growing entrepreneurship ecosystem. We have incubators, VC funds, accelerators, mentor networks, co-works, and so on. To build a startup is a lot easier than before. And recently, we have got something fantastic, smartphones. Yes, smartphones. As in all emerging countries, the elites have been connected for a long time, but the vast majority of our people are connected from their smartphone just recently, around 6 or 7 years, as a result of the fall in the prices of cell phones and broadband. Upon enjoying the new and high standard of services that the wonderful global apps provide, our citizens began to demand the same service level from established companies, but these companies were unable to meet this requirement. Perhaps as a result of the region's late connectivity, very few corporations have completed their digital transformation. Both new available technologies and service gaps create a great opportunity for entrepreneurs. But, and there is always a but, as you know, reality is cruel. 90% of our startups fail. Funding is very, very hard. We have built very few unicorns and a big etc. Blame all this bad news on the valley of death. We could model the ideal life cycle of a startup in Latin America in this way. It all starts with an opportunity based on a problem. Then we launch our project. Then we quickly go through the valley of death until we reach break even, and then we become very successful, ideally. By the way, as we all know, the valley of death is the initial period when income is not enough to pay for our business expenses. But reality is a bit different than this picture. Three major drawbacks act as a force of gravity that pulls the line down. In our plan, we made wrong assumptions. Unexpected problems arise, and we ignore what to do in the face of these challenges. As a consequence, our startup goes bankrupt instead of reaching break-even. Now you know why this initial and dangerous period is named the Valley of Death. Sadly, consequences are brutal for our ecosystem. The most dramatic image of this situation is that we were wiped off the unicorn world map some years ago. As you can see, North America is there, Europe is there, Africa is there, and Asia are there. But LATAM is not there. That's too bad. Unluckily, our results were so small that we didn't even appear on the map. Why is this? What's the reason for this negative scenario? We found three main causes. First, for historical reason, we had the wrong mindset. We just didn't think big. Since Chile is similar to an island, as I told you, and until now, its economy based on the extraction of natural resources has been relatively successful for those who have power, large companies don't need to innovate, and they influence the design of the laws so that everything remains mainly the same. The incentives to innovate or to think big are very low. Second, imported, imported entrepreneurial methodologies don't work. It's not the same to build a startup in a developed country than in an emerging one. If you wanted to plant a tree in the Amazonas jungle, for instance, you would just drop a seed and a big tree would grow because there are so many nutrients, water, and sun. But if you want to get the same result in the Atacama Desert, applying the same technique, nothing will happen, since the Atacama Desert is the least fertile desert in the world, as I told you before. Every ecosystem requires its own technique. Emerging countries not only don't have the funding levels of developed markets, but our people have little access to banking services, our industries are a lot less competitive, and our problems are quite different. So why would you use the same methodology to build a startup in an emerging market than the one you use in a developed one? It won't work. Simply, it won't work. And the same happens in every latitude. Every specific region has special conditions and need its own methodology. Third, we didn't know about strategy in entrepreneurship. We didn't know about entrepreneurial strategy. Simply, as entrepreneurship is quite new in Latin America, our universities didn't include entrepreneurial strategy in their MBAs, until just very, very recently. So, no good news. Wrong mindset, wrong methodology, no strategy. To get to the developed stage as a country and as a region as well, we need more and better startups. We had to solve these problems. What to do? How can we solve them? First, to try to change our mindset, in 2010, we founded Startup Chile. The idea was to invite entrepreneurs from all over the world to start their companies in Chile so they could inoculate a new way of thinking in our entrepreneurial ecosystem. 10 years later, this objective has been perfectly met, and Startup Chile model has been replicated by many countries. As a second step, we designed the startup journey. The answer to the lack of a suitable methodology was the startup journey. That's an entrepreneurial methodology to maximize the odds of success of a startup, specifically, designed for emerging countries. This methodology is based on practices that are the fittest for each phase of a startup journey in a typical emerging market context, as well as providing us with a methodology. The startup journey itself, and especially its practices, could also help us to solve our lack of strategy. To build the startup journey methodology, as a first step, we designed a map to cross the valley of death. This map has 4 phases. First, the road to the valley, when you have to prepare what you could need to cross afterwards. Then the launch of your startup, when you activate your surviving mode. The entrance to the valley, when you learn from the real world everything you can. And finally, the escape phase, when you pivot, which means to adapt your business model to whatever you need to get to break even, based on what you learned before, naturally. This is the map to cross the valley of death. Here you may be thinking, okay, I got the map, but what should I do in each phase? To answer that question, we sought the fittest entrepreneurial practices for emerging environments for each one of those phases. We accomplished this analyzing the actions that successful startups executed, which helped them in these environments. We named them PRIMS, for Prácticas Emprendedoras in Spanish, in honor of the biological genes and Richard Dawkins' memes. Just as biological species need phenotypes that fit their environment to adapt to it, startups need the fittest PRIMS to survive. As we know, 200 years ago, Charles Darwin stated, "It's not the strongest species that survives, but the one that best adapts to its environment." We could add developing the appropriate attributes to fit that environment. Species are packages of phenotypes that will last if they are suitable. The shark, who has to survive hunting this prey in the depth of the sea where there is no light, has developed the ability to detect electrical signals emitted by other animals. This characteristic is an example of an adapted attribute. Evolutionary concepts are also valid in the business dimension. Products with suitable attributes will be able to survive and succeed in the market. At a company level, these attributes are the practices that these companies carry out to execute their operation and business. The same happens with startups. What determines that a startup can survive and succeed is the set of practices it carries out. Same as in biology, these practices must fit the environment in which the startup develops. Then we can conclude that the practices necessary for a startup to be successful are strongly dependent on its environment. This implies that we cannot import practices from different ecosystems. So we need to discover our own fittest practices. This is exactly what we did, or what we tried to do. Working together with universities, we analyzed thousands of startups, understanding what practices were carried out by those startups that were successful. 14 of these streams stood out notably, and several were very specific to our markets. We will take a closer look at some of them. One of the first key primes that rises the probability of success of a startup is the right choice of the opportunity. For the opportunity to be eligible, we must be passionate about the problem we are solving. The opportunity has to be able to create value, to be scalable, profitable, timely, which means to face a growing market, but not too crowded, very flexible, in order to allow us to pivot, since every startup pivots at least once, and be appropriable. The opportunity has to be appropriable to let us operate with no competition, or at least to offer ways to build strong and sustainable competitive advantages. If one of these attributes is not present in the opportunity, the probability of success will drop considerably. Another of the primes that should be highlighted, and maybe the most important in our environments, is the focus on survival, which means break even. Focus on survival. There is just one important objective for a new venture: to survive. Survive, survive. Emerging markets don't have VC funds to finance long values of that. Values of that are not, we simply don't have money to finance long values of death. Given that, our startups must seek to break even as a top priority. Not reaching it represents dying, as simple as that, just dying. That's why, in the initial phase, the top priority should be survival, which means to act with a sense of urgency to do as soon as possible whatever is needed to reach break-even. This is a very healthy practice that could be adopted by everyone, by the way, anywhere, anywhere, regardless of whether it's a startup from an emerging country or not. Focusing on break-even means aligning with the market with high priority. So it seems quite a good idea, no? Talking about surviving, fail fast, fail cheap, doesn't work in emerging countries. We need to succeed because we don't have the time or money or culture to fail. Of course, we understand pretty well what's behind this mantra about daring and learning, but the consequences of failing are too severe to take it literally. This is a good example of an imported practice that needs to be adapted for emerging countries. We prefer to replace it with design good hypotheses and then test and iterate as fast as possible. This is starting to sound as a strategy. It might help. Talking about strategy, the last prim I would like to mention is appropriability. Appropriability is the technique that allows a startup to economically capture the value that it creates, defending itself against imitators. Very few startups develop an appropriability strategy in emerging markets because it's not that easy to find the right one. Patents don't work in Latin America. The patenting process takes 4 years and 2 more to defend your IP from a competitor. Of course, traditional appropriability tactics like branding, scale, or embedding are not options for fragile startups either. So what can we do? We have found 3 alternatives to accomplish appropriability in our markets, which, by the way, are PRIMs too. We call the first protected problems. These are problems that exist only in emerging countries and are off the radar of developed market startups. Focusing on them, on these protected problems, allows startups from emerging economies to avoid powerful competitors in a convenient form of organic innovation. For instance, as a result of the inequality of Latin America, a certain type of crime proliferates. This problem is the kind that can be tackled by local startups, by our startups, avoiding competition from startups from developed countries with large funding available, simply because they don't know this problem exists at all. A second technique to get appropriability is strategic orchestration. Orchestration seeks to articulate third-party assets to use them in creating the startup products. This articulation provides us efficiency, since we don't have to invest in our own assets, provide us flexibility as well. If we need to pivot, we could disconnect a node and connect a different one. And finally, orchestration generates appropriability. The complexity of building this network makes hard to a potential rival to imitate the structure. The third way to get appropriability is related with network effects. As you may know, network effects occur when a product or service gets more valuable, when more customers use it, which in turn reduces the acquisition cost of new customers. We have been using this technique just since recently because our online user numbers are growing since no long ago. So these were some examples of PRIMs we found in our research. Applying this methodology and these practices, we might be able to finally overcome the valley of death. So we could declare the death of the valley of death. Believe it or not, even in Atacama Desert, life can flourish. But solving the valley of death for some startups is not enough. We need suitable practices to be transferred from one startup to another continuously. We need to replicate practices. We need practices replicators. One form of our replicator can be a mentor who replicates the practices that work well in a previous successful startup towards other startups. This is why we created mentor networks a while ago. Co-works can be a different form of PRIM replicators. In a co-work, startups learn the practices that work from neighbors. This is why we created incentives for the installation of co-works a couple of years ago. Now we are working on the ultimate practices replicator. We strongly believe that entrepreneurship can be structured and taught. So we developed Evolution. Evolution is a digital incubation platform that uses AI to learn the fittest practices from previous incubation instances. Then Evolution, this platform, recommends the fittest practices to the next startups in search of maximizing their probability of success. So we use AI to recommend PRIMs. Do you want to know the results we've got? Nothing is perfect, of course, but we got our first digital unicorns and a bunch of heroic founders that everybody wants to imitate there in Latin America. We got a standard entrepreneurial process with a common language and an adapted methodology that can be taught. We got a scalable model suitable to our reality. We got a cohesive entrepreneurship ecosystem in which each participant knows its role and collaborates with others. But what's more important is that we are increasing the number of startups and reducing the failure rate, which was the goal at the beginning. What have we learned so far in our journey? First, digital entrepreneurship is a huge opportunity that can bring prosperity and equality, especially in emerging countries. To ensure that our structured entrepreneurship methodology will always evolve as needed, we have to build an ecosystem of practice replicators and empower it by any mean. Being AI, a very interesting option, as I told you. And third, we still have a lot to learn from nature. Survival, for instance, is a priority in nature, in entrepreneurship as well. Each ecosystem needs its own specific evolutionary dynamic and attributes, and competitive strategies must fit their environments to be viable, same as in biology, same as in nature. But naturally, we still have a lot to do. Surviving is not enough. After overcoming the valley of death, a startup has to scale, a phase that also requires the fittest practices like the previous ones. But I will leave this for a future talk, so I have an excuse to come back to Singapore again. Thank you so much.